The blast doors came down at 0347 hours and took 17 seconds to complete their descent. I counted. 17 seconds for 300 tons of adamantium to seal us inside level Tertius -9 of Hive Castellan. And in those 17 seconds, the world I knew ended with a sound like a god clearing its throat. I was awake because the recycler fans in my hab unit had been making that grinding noise again, the one that meant the bearings were failing, and I had been lying there in the dark listening to it and calculating whether I could afford the repair tithe or whether I should just learn to sleep through the sound. Such small concerns, such magnificent irrelevance. The blast doors made a different sound than the recycler fans. They made the sound of finality, of geological time compressed into 17 seconds. The floor shook, the walls shook, the stale air in my lungs shook, and then silence fell like a physical weight, broken only by the distant beginning of screams. My name is Garrett Oakes. I was 43 years old when the doors came down, a water reclamation supervisor for Sub-District 7 of level Tertius -9. I managed a team of 11 technicians who maintained the purification systems that kept 200,000 people hydrated with liquid that had passed through human bodies an average of 47 times. I knew the exact mineral content of our water. I knew the acceptable thresholds for biological contamination. I knew how to coax another weaker function from filters that should have been replaced 3 years prior. None of that knowledge prepared me for what came after. The first hours were confusion. I dressed in the dark because the main lumens had failed with the door closure, leaving only the emergency strips that painted everything in dull amber. My wife Deanna was already at the door of our hab unit when I emerged from the sleeping chamber, her face strange and orange in that emergency light. "Where are you going?" I asked her. "To find out what happened," she said. I told her to stay. She did not stay. Deanna had never been good at staying when something needed to be known. She had worked in the administrative archives for 22 years and had developed an addiction to information that I had learned to accommodate rather than cure. She left, and I followed, and we joined the river of bodies flowing toward the main transit corridor where the blast doors had come down. The crowd at the doors was already 3,000 deep when we arrived. People pressing against adamantium, the sound of fists on metal, the sound of voices asking questions no one could answer. Why? What? When? How long? Above the doors, the emergency voxcaster crackled with static and then spoke in a voice I recognized. Administratum Prefect Halverson, whose signature I had seen on 100 requisition denials. His voice was calm, his voice was measured, his voice said words that meant nothing. Citizens of level Tertius -9. A containment protocol has been initiated for your safety and the safety of the greater Hive. Remain calm. Essential services will be maintained. Further information will be provided when available. The Emperor protects. The voxcaster clicked off. The static returned. The crowd made a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a moan, something between rage and despair that had no proper name. Deanna gripped my arm. Her fingers were cold. "Containment," she said. "Garrett, what are they containing?" I did not know. No one knew. That was the first hook that caught in my mind and would not let go. Not the doors themselves, not the crowd, not the failing lights. The question. What were they containing? What had happened on our level that required sealing 10 million souls inside a metal tomb? We returned to our hab unit because there was nothing else to do. The corridors were filling with people who had nowhere to go and nothing to do but speculate. I heard the word plague 17 times on the walk home. I heard the word uprising 11 times. I heard the word Xenos 4 times whispered like a prayer spoken backward. The recycler fan in our unit was still grinding. Somehow that sound had become a comfort. 3 days passed before the water pressure dropped. I noticed it first because noticing water was my profession. The flow from our tap had decreased by approximately 15%, which meant the pumping stations on level Tertius 8 were either failing or had been deliberately throttled. I reported to my workstation on the third day because that was what I had always done and because doing something felt better than doing nothing. My team had gathered. Marcus Webb, my senior technician, a man of 56 years who had spent 30 of them watching water move through pipes, looked at me with eyes that expected answers. "What do we do?" he asked. "We do our jobs," I said. "We keep the water clean. We keep it flowing. We do what we have always done." This satisfied him. This satisfied the others. People need structure when the world loses its shape. They need routine like they need oxygen. I gave them both. The purification systems on our level were designed to recycle approximately 800 million liters per day. This was sufficient for our population under normal circumstances, assuming the input from the levels above continued. Without that input, we would be operating on a closed loop. The water would cycle and cycle and cycle, accumulating contaminants, requiring more and more aggressive filtration, until eventually the filters themselves became the contamination. I did the calculations in my head while my team worked. At our current consumption rate with no external input, we had perhaps 6 months before the water became dangerous to drink, perhaps 8 months before it became lethal. This assumed no major system failures. This assumed no sabotage. This assumed people continued to use water at their normal rate. None of these assumptions would hold. On the 5th day, Prefect Halverson spoke again through the emergency voxcasters. His voice was still calm. His voice was still measured. He informed us that the containment protocol remained in effect. He informed us that essential services would continue. He informed us that a representative from the upper levels would be arriving to assess our situation and provide guidance. A representative, someone from outside, someone who could open the doors or at least explain why they had closed. The crowd at the blast doors reformed within the hour. This time there were 8,000 people. This time they were quieter, more watchful, more hopeful, in a way that made my stomach clench. Hope is dangerous in the Imperium. Hope is a blade that cuts the one who holds it. I went to the doors with Deanna because she insisted and because I wanted to see this representative for myself. We pushed through the crowd until we found a position with a clear sight line to the massive adamantium barrier. The emergency lights had been supplemented by portable lumen globes that the Arbites had set up, creating islands of harsh white in the amber darkness. We waited for 4 hours. People prayed, people wept, people stood in silence and stared at metal. Then the voxcaster above the doors crackled, and a new voice spoke. Female, sharp, authority wrapped in consonants. Citizens of level Tertius 9. I am Sub-Prefect Miranda Chen of the Departamento Administratum. I have been assigned as your liaison to the upper levels during this containment period. I am currently on the other side of this door. I can hear you. I am here to help. The crowd made a sound, not a roar, not a moan, something like relief mixed with suspicion. Sub-Prefect Chen continued speaking. She explained that the containment protocol had been initiated due to a potential biological threat detected in our level's atmospheric processes. She explained that tests were being conducted. She explained that if the tests proved negative, the doors would be reopened. She explained that we needed to remain calm and cooperative. She did not explain what the biological threat was. She did not explain how long the tests would take. She did not explain why the doors had been sealed before anyone on our level had been informed of any threat. The crowd began shouting questions. Chen waited for the noise to subside, then answered some of them with words that sounded like answers but contained no actual information. I watched the blast doors while she spoke. 300 tons of adamantium perfectly sealed without even a viewing port. Chen could hear us, she said, but we could not see her. We had only her voice, we had only her promises. Deanna looked at me. She is lying, Deanna said. I can hear it in her voice. 22 years in the archives taught me how bureaucrats sound when they are reading from approved scripts. I did not disagree. The days accumulated like sediment. On day 12, the first food riots began in the commercial district. The merchants had been maintaining their stocks, but without resupply from above, certain items had become scarce. Protein paste, vitamin supplements, the cheap stimulant drinks that factory workers used to push through double shifts. People who had never committed violence in their lives discovered what they were capable of when their children cried from hunger. The Arbeits responded with shockmores and suppression gas. 17 people died in the first riot. 43 more died over the following week in smaller incidents. The Arbeits established rationing protocols without consulting the civilian administrators, and the civilian administrators protested, and the Arbeits ignored them because they had the weapons and the authority of fear. I kept my team working. The water had to keep flowing. That was my purpose. That was my anchor. Marcus Webb came to me on day 15 with a report that made my hands shake. He had been monitoring the input feeds from level Tertius 8, the level immediately above us, looking for any sign that the external water supply might be restored. What he found instead was silence, complete silence, no data, no readings, no indication that level Tertius 8 existed at all. The feeds should have shown something, he said. Even if they had cut us off, the sensors would register the dead lines. Instead, there is nothing. It is as if the level above us has been removed from the cogitator networks entirely. I considered this. I considered what it meant. Diana had been spending her days in the archives, digging through old records, searching for any precedent for our situation. She came home that night with a data slate full of information and a face drained of color. "Garrett," she said, "I found something. Level Tertius 9 is not the first level to be sealed. There have been others, 12 others, over the past 200 years. None of them were ever reopened." I took the data slate from her hands. I read the records she had compiled. Names and dates and population figures. Level Secundus 17, sealed in 847. M41, population 3, 2 million. Level Primus 4, sealed in 901. M41, population 8, 7 million. Level Tertius 2, sealed in 934. M41, population 6, 1 million. No records of reopening, no records of the populations being relocated, no records at all after the sealing dates. "What happened to them?" I asked. "I do not know," Diana said. "The records simply stop." We sat in the amber darkness of our hab unit and listened to the recycler fan grind and did not speak for a long time. Sub-Prefect Chen continued her broadcasts every third day. Her voice remained calm. Her voice remained measured. She reported that the tests were ongoing. She reported that progress was being made. She reported that the Departamento Administratum was committed to resolving our situation with all appropriate haste. On day 22, someone in the crowd at the blast doors asked her about the other sealed levels, about Secundus 17 and Primus 4 and Tertius 2. Chen paused before answering. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted. "Those situations were different," she said. "Those levels faced genuine biological contamination that could not be remediated. Your situation is precautionary. The protocols are different." The crowd did not believe her. I could feel the disbelief spreading like temperature change through water. People who had been standing still began to shift. People who had been quiet began to murmur. Chen must have sensed it too. "I am telling you the truth," she said, and her voice was still calm, but something underneath it had changed. "I understand your fear. I share your fear. I am doing everything in my power to expedite your release. You have to trust me." Someone in the crowd laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. Day 30 brought the first structural failures. A water main in Sub-District 3 burst without warning, flooding a hab block and drowning 9 people before the emergency valves could be closed. The repair teams I dispatched found the pipe corroded from the inside, the metal eaten through by chemical reactions that should have taken decades to develop. Our closed-loop system was accelerating the degradation. The water was becoming more aggressive as it cycled, stripping minerals from the pipes themselves. I reported this to the civil administrators. They reported it to the Arbeits. The Arbeits did nothing because there was nothing to be done. We did not have the materials to replace the failing infrastructure. We did not have the manufacturing capacity to create those materials. We had only what we had, and what we had was slowly dissolving. Marcus Webb began drinking. I did not blame him. I might have joined him if I had not needed to remain functional for my team. Deanna continued her research. She had become obsessed with understanding why we had been sealed. If she could determine the cause, she reasoned, perhaps she could determine the cure. Perhaps there was something we could do, some action we could take, that would convince the authorities to release us. On day 34, she found it. I was at my workstation when she arrived, her eyes red from staring at data slates, her hands trembling. She pulled me into a supply closet and closed the door before speaking. "It is not biological," she said, "the containment. It was never biological." I waited for her to continue. "Level Tertius 9 processes 23% of the Hive's industrial waste," she said. 6 months ago there was an accident at Processing Station 7, a containment breach, toxic chemicals released into the atmosphere. The reports were suppressed. The workers who witnessed it were reassigned to other levels, and then sealed inside when the doors came down, I said. "No," she said, "they were removed before the sealing. Garrett, the people who knew about the accident were evacuated. This level was sealed to contain the contamination and to eliminate the witnesses. We are not being quarantined, we are being disposed of." I did not want to believe her. I wanted there to be another explanation, some bureaucratic error, some miscommunication that could be corrected. But I had lived in the Imperium for 43 years. I knew how the administratum functioned. I knew the calculus of acceptable losses. 10 million people, a rounding error in a hive of 17 billion. That night, Deanna and I lay in our hab unit and listened to the recycler fan and did not sleep. The grinding sound had become louder. The bearings were failing faster now, accelerated by the same chemical changes that were destroying our pipes. "What do we do?" Deanna asked. I did not have an answer. Day 40 brought the cascade failures. 3 pumping stations went offline within 6 hours of each other, their components corroded beyond repair. Water pressure dropped across the entire level by 40%. The rationing protocols that the Arbeits had established became meaningless because there was simply not enough water to ration. People began fighting over access to the functioning taps. The Arbeits responded with increasing violence. Bodies accumulated in the corridors, some killed by shock mauls, others killed by dehydration, others killed by their neighbors in disputes over containers of recycled water. I kept my team working because stopping would have meant accepting that we were already dead. We patched what we could patch. We sealed what we could seal. We watched the system fail one component at a time and pretended that our efforts mattered. Sub-Prefect Chen continued her broadcasts. Her voice was still calm. Her voice was still measured. But now, underneath the calm, I could hear something else. Strain, fatigue, fear. "The tests are taking longer than expected," she said on day 43. "There have been complications, but progress is being made. You must remain patient. You must remain calm." Someone in the crowd threw something at the blast doors. The sound it made when it struck the adamantium was small and pathetic. I stopped going to the broadcasts after that. There was too much work to do and too few people left to do it. 3 of my technicians had died. 2 more had abandoned their posts to focus on their families. Marcus Webb was still working, still drinking, still showing up every day, with hands that shook and eyes that expected nothing. On day 47, I found something. I was inspecting a junction box in the main processing facility when I noticed a conduit that should not have been there. A secondary line, unmarked on any schematic, running parallel to the primary water main. I followed it through the maintenance corridors, through access panels that required codes I should not have possessed but that had been left unchanged since before the sealing, through forgotten spaces between walls where rats had built their colonies. The conduit led to a sealed chamber in the industrial district, a chamber with its own power supply, its own filtration system, its own environmental controls, a chamber that was not on any map I had ever seen. Inside the chamber I found supplies, water, protein paste, medical equipment, emergency communications gear, enough to sustain perhaps 500 people for 2 years. And I found bodies, 17 of them, arranged in a neat row, their faces peaceful, their eyes closed. They had been dead for approximately 6 weeks, judging by the state of decomposition. They had died of suffocation, judging by the coloration of their skin. I recognized 3 of them, administratum officials who had disappeared in the first days after the sealing, people I had assumed had been killed in the initial chaos. On the wall above the bodies, someone had written a message in what appeared to be their own blood. The letters were shaky but legible. "The doors will never open. We knew too much. Forgive us." I stood in that chamber for a long time. I read the message. I looked at the bodies. I understood finally the full shape of what had been done to us. These people had been prepared for the sealing. They had been given supplies, given shelter, given everything they needed to survive. And then someone had sealed them inside this chamber and cut their air supply, because even the survivors had known too much. We were not being quarantined. We were not being tested. We were being erased, all of us. Every soul on level Tertius 9. The supplies were still good. The water was still clean. The communications gear was still functional. I made a choice. I took the communications unit. I left the supplies for others to find. I returned to the main level through the same route I had used to enter, and I went home to Deanna, and I showed her what I had found. She stared at the communications unit for a long time. "Can you reach the outside?" she asked. "I do not know," I said, "but I am going to try." We spent 3 days attempting to establish contact with anyone beyond our sealed level. The communications unit had limited range, but it was designed to punch through interference, to reach frequencies that civilian equipment could not access. On the 3rd day, we received a response. The voice that answered was not Sub-Prefect Chen. It was male, old, tired. It identified itself as Clerk Senior Augustus Hayes of the Departamento Administratum Archives. He spoke quickly, nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "I know what happened to your level," he said. "I know why you were sealed. I have been trying to find someone to tell for 6 weeks. No one will listen. No one wants to know." "Tell us," I said. Hayes told us. The processing station accident had released a compound into the atmosphere, not biological, chemical. A byproduct of weapons manufacturing that had been illegally dumped in civilian waste streams. The compound was not immediately lethal, but it accumulated in human tissue over time. Anyone who had been breathing the air of level Tertius 9 for more than 30 days was contaminated beyond remediation. The sealing had not been to protect the hive from a biological threat. It had been to contain the evidence of industrial negligence at the highest levels of the hive's administration. Level Tertius 9 was being sacrificed to protect the reputations of people who would never face consequences for their actions. Hayes had documentation. He had records. He had proof. And he was going to be dead within the hour, he said, because he had been discovered accessing those records, and the people who had ordered our sealing did not tolerate witnesses. I asked him if there was anything he could do for us, any way to reverse the sealing, to evacuate even a portion of our population. He laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. "The sealing protocols cannot be reversed," he said. "The doors are designed to remain closed until the internal atmosphere has been purged, until everyone inside is dead." "How long?" I asked. "The protocols assume 6 months," he said. "By then the contamination will have spread through the closed air system. Every resident will be saturated. The doors will open automatically once the air scrubbers detect no biological activity." He paused, I could hear sounds in the background, shouting, footsteps. "I am sorry," he said. "I wish I could have done more. I wish anyone could have done more." The transmission cut off. Diana and I sat in our hab unit and did not speak. Outside, I could hear the sounds of a level dying, distant screams, closer explosions, the grinding of machinery failing. The recycler fan in our unit had finally stopped. Day 53. The Arbites had lost control of most of the level. Gangs had formed, territorial groups that controlled access to the remaining functional water points. The gang leaders were people I had known, people I had worked with, people who had been ordinary citizens until the doors came down and survival became the only law that mattered. Marcus Webb was dead. He had been killed trying to protect a water main in Sub-District 4 from sabotage. The gang that controlled that district had decided to destroy what they could not monopolize. Marcus had argued with them. Marcus had refused to stand aside. Marcus had died with a shock maul embedded in his skull. I buried him in the filtration room where he had spent 30 years of his life. There was no priest. There was no ceremony. I said the words I remembered from my childhood, words about the Emperor's light and the soul's journey, and I covered his body with maintenance tarps and walked away. Diana had stopped leaving our hab unit. The air was bad now, thick with contaminants that made breathing difficult. I brought her water when I could find it. I brought her food when I could steal it. I told her stories about our life before, about our courtship, about our wedding day, about the small joys we had accumulated over 20 years of marriage. She listened, she smiled, she coughed blood into her hands and did not mention it. On day 57, Sub-Prefect Chen's broadcast stopped. No announcement, no explanation, simply silence where her voice had been. The crowds at the blast doors dispersed, having nothing left to wait for. That night, I went to the blast doors alone. The emergency lights had mostly failed by then. The corridor was dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of dying lumen globes. I stood before 300 tons of adamantium and placed my palm against the cold metal. I thought about the 17 people in the hidden chamber. I thought about Clerk Senior, Hayes. I thought about all the souls on all the sealed levels, all the millions who had been erased to protect secrets and reputations. The door was cold, the door was silent, the door would never open while I was alive. I returned to my hab unit. Diana was asleep, her breathing shallow, her skin grey. I lay beside her and watched her chest rise and fall, and wondered how many more times I would see that motion. Day 62 brought a visitor. I was scavenging in the industrial district, searching for salvageable components, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting a gang member, expecting violence. Instead, I found a woman in Arbite's carapace armor, her helmet removed, her face gaunt. She was perhaps 30 years old, with short, dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Garrett Oakes," she said. "Water Reclamation Supervisor. Former Water Reclamation Supervisor." I nodded. "I am Sergeant Beatrice Holloway," she said. "I have a proposal for you." Holloway explained. The Arbite's command structure had collapsed. Most of the senior officers had retreated to a fortified position in the administrative district, hoarding supplies and waiting to die in comfort. But a group of junior Arbites led by Holloway had refused to accept this fate. They wanted to fight. Not for survival, which was impossible, but for documentation. For record. For the truth to survive even if they did not. They had found the hidden chamber. They had found the bodies. They had found the message on the wall. And they had found the same communications unit that I had discovered weeks earlier. "We have been transmitting," Holloway said, "every day, every hour, everything we know. Someone, somewhere, is receiving our signal. Someone will know what was done here." She looked at me with eyes that expected nothing and hoped for everything. "We need someone who understands the systems," she said. "Someone who can keep the communications equipment functioning. Someone who can help us transmit until the very end." I thought about Deanna lying in our HAB unit, her breath growing weaker. I thought about Marcus Webb buried in the filtration room. I thought about the recycler fan that had finally stopped grinding. I said yes. The transmission station was set up in a maintenance bay in the industrial district. 12 people worked there in shifts, compiling records, drafting testimonies, broadcasting on every frequency the equipment could reach. Most of them were Arbeits. A few were civilians who had stumbled upon the operation and asked to help. My job was keeping the equipment functional, scavenging parts, jury-rigging repairs, squeezing every last hour of operation from components that had never been designed for this kind of abuse. Deanna joined us on day 67. She was too weak to walk, so I carried her. The air in our HAB unit had become unbreathable, and I would not let her die alone in the dark. She helped compose the testimonies. Her administratum training made her invaluable for organizing information, for ensuring that our records were coherent and verifiable. She worked until she could no longer hold a stylus, and then she dictated until she could no longer speak. She died on day 71, with her hand in mine and her last words a message to whoever might receive our transmissions. Remember us. Remember that we lived. Remember that we were people, not statistics. Remember. I buried her next to Marcus Webb in the filtration room, under maintenance tarps that I arranged as carefully as I could manage with shaking hands. The words I spoke over her body were not Imperial prayers. They were the words she had spoken to me on our wedding day 20 years before. Whatever comes, she had said, we face it together. Whatever comes. I returned to the transmission station and continued working. Day 78, we received a response. The voice that came through the communications unit was crisp, professional, female. It identified itself as Inquisitorial Acolyte Renata Vance of the Ordo Hereticus. Level Tertius 9, the voice said. Your transmissions have been received and logged. Your documentation of administrative malfeasance has been forwarded to appropriate authorities. Your testimony will be preserved. Holloway grabbed the transmitter. Can you open the doors? She demanded. Can you evacuate survivors? There was a pause. When Acolyte Vance spoke again, her voice was careful. The sealing protocols cannot be reversed externally, she said. The technical constraints are absolute. However, your transmissions have prompted an investigation into the administrative decisions that led to your containment. Those responsible will face consequences. What consequences? Holloway asked. Another pause. The Inquisition does not share details of ongoing investigations, Acolyte Vance said. But I can tell you this, the Lord Governor of Hive Castellan has been taken into custody. The Departamento Administratum officials who authorized your sealing are being interrogated. Their crimes will not be hidden. Holloway laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. We are going to die, she said, all of us, 10 million people, and your justice is interrogations and custody? Acolyte Vance was silent for a moment. I know, she said, and her voice had changed, become softer, almost human. I know it is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what I can offer. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Your testimony will endure. The transmission ended. Holloway stared at the communications unit for a long time. Then she stood, squared her shoulders, and addressed the 11 people who remained in the station. You heard her, she said. Our testimony will endure, so let us make sure there is something worth enduring. Back to work. We worked. Day 84. The transmission station had become the last functioning outpost on level Tertius 9. The gangs had destroyed each other in a final spasm of violence. The remaining civilian population had retreated into their HAB units to die in whatever privacy they could find. The air was poison, the water was poison. Everything was poison. 8 of us remained. Holloway, 3 of her Arbeits, 4 civilians including me. We transmitted our final testimonies, our names, our stories, our final words to anyone who might care to listen. I spoke of Deanna, I spoke of Marcus Webb, I spoke of the recycler fans and the water that had cycled through human bodies 47 times. I spoke of the 17 seconds it took for the blast doors to come down. I spoke of a level that had lived and worked and loved and died, and I asked whoever was listening to remember that we had been real. On day 85, the power failed. We gathered in the darkness, the 8 of us, listening to each other breathe. The communications equipment was dead, the lights were dead, everything was dead except us, and we would not be far behind. Holloway spoke into the darkness. "It was worth it," she said, "what we did. It was worth it." No one disagreed. I do not know how long we sat there in the dark. Hours perhaps longer. Time had become meaningless. Then I heard something, a sound, distant but unmistakable, metal grinding against metal, the blast doors moving. We stumbled toward the sound, guiding ourselves by memory and touch. The darkness was absolute. The air burned in my lungs with every breath. The sound grew louder. When we reached the main corridor, I could see light, thin strips of it, seeping through the widening gap between the blast doors, harsh white light from the level above. The doors were opening. We stopped, the 8 of us, staring at that impossible light. Holloway reached for her sidearm. I did not understand why until I did. "They are not opening the doors to rescue us," she said. "They are opening them because the 6 months are almost over, because they expect us to be dead, because they are coming to document their success." I watched the gap widen. I saw shapes moving in the light, figures in environmental suits carrying equipment, preparing to enter our tomb. "We could surrender," one of the Arbite said. "Tell them we survived. Demand medical treatment." Holloway shook her head. "They sealed us in here to eliminate witnesses," she said. "They will not allow witnesses to leave." The gap was nearly a meter wide now. The figures in environmental suits were gathering at the threshold. Holloway raised her sidearm. I made my choice. I stepped forward, into the light. I raised my hands to show they were empty. I walked toward the figures in their suits, toward the gap in the doors, toward whatever was waiting on the other side. Behind me, Holloway did not fire. I heard her curse. I heard her follow. The figures in environmental suits watched us approach. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others to hold. When I reached the gap, I stopped. I looked up at the figure who had raised his hand. Through the faceplate of his suit, I could see an old man's face, weathered and tired. "I am Garrett Oakes," I said. "I am a survivor of level Tertius 9. I have testimony to offer. I will not be silenced." The old man studied me for a long moment. Then he turned to one of his companions and spoke through his suit's Vox unit. "Contact Acolyte Vance," he said. "Tell her she was right. There are survivors." He turned back to me. "You are under inquisitorial protection," he said. "Effective immediately. No one will silence you." I stepped through the gap, into the light, into the world that had sealed us inside to die. Behind me, 7 others followed. 8 survivors out of 10 million. We carried their stories with us. We carried Deanna. We carried Marcus Webb. We carried the 17 people in the hidden chamber, the message written in blood, the 17 seconds it took for the doors to come down. We carried the testimony that would not be erased. And somewhere, in the upper spires of Hive Castellan, the people who had ordered our deaths were learning that their secrets had not stayed buried. The light was harsh. The air burned. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. I kept walking.